Greer and Erica this evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. I was at Malaprop's last week, and I am not too far from Asheville, just about 2 hours. Greer, is so lovely to see you. I think this is our fourth event together, but our first virtual event. Does that sound right?
That sounds about right. I can think of several in person, but I cannot think of another virtual one. So, although in the early lockdown days of the pandemic, that all sort of blurs together as far as virtual events. Maybe we did. I don't know.
That's true. That's true. Well, I am so excited about the 13th Husband, which I started reading last night. Do you want to read a little excerpt for us to get started?
I could, yeah.
Okay, great. I thought you were going to say no for 1 second. I was like, oh, wait, are you going to say that?
It's funny because I usually have a piece picked out, and then I did an event 2 nights ago where the person said, "Will you read?" And I'm like, sure. So now I do know which part I want to read, and I hope you have a little bit of Hollow Bones picked out too to share. All right. So this is The 13th Husband. It is a novel. So it's fiction, but it's about a real person, Aimee Crocker, who was a Gilded Age heiress. And I will just start you out at the very beginning. It starts with a quote from Aimee herself, so I'll read that, and then we'll launch into what I don't call a prologue, except that it does come at the beginning of the book before chapter 1. So make your own decision about what it is. But here's the quote from Aimee. "That's about all we get out of life, rich or poor, isn't it? A few hours of enjoyment here and there. I think it is folly to allow a single chance for pleasure to slip past you." So she said that in 1911. And I'll read just this little intro bit. It's a little over a page. "You know, don't you, that I've been fighting this nearly my entire life? I don't expect sympathy, of course, from you or anyone. There's been precious little of that. Certainly none from the tabloid press. People think the rich don't struggle, and I understand why. Money solves so many problems, opens so many doors. That's why I held on to mine instead of giving it away. It was the only power I could count on. Because I was so very rich at almost any point in my life when I wanted to go somewhere, I went. For a woman in these times, that was no small thing. But with the tabloids dogging my steps, painting me with their scarlet brush in my very girlhood, I had my own struggles. The press called me wild, among other things. They were outraged by the notion of a woman determined to make her own choices. They labeled me an adventuress, a hussy, a known menace. Even when the Philadelphia Inquirer loudly proclaimed me the Queen of Bohemia, it wasn't entirely a compliment. And when I'm dead, they'll trumpet my husband's names in the headlines as if my marriages were all that mattered. I am more than gold bands and paperwork." Of course, there are men in my story. Some would say an unseemly number. There's love and scandal, heartbreak and poison, passion and deceit. It takes place in courtrooms and orphanages, palaces and temples, in Hawaii and Tokyo and the world around. And in my story, there are also questions, so many questions, one of which you are the answer to. The three things that have haunted me all these decades are simple enough to name: the tabloids, the Spanish fortune teller's prophecy, and the woman in white. Where to begin? Not at the beginning. That would be expected. And you know as well as anyone, doing the expected was never my style. Let's start, instead, in the middle. There we go.
So good. So good. Well, I'll read a little. I'll read a little from Hollow Bones. I also have something that happens before chapter 1, but I'm not calling a prologue.
We've been told that prologues are not okay.
Right.
But there's still sometimes a reason to do a little thing before chapter 1.
Exactly right. So, yeah. So this is a week. It's a week before the fire is what I call mine. And I'm going to skip around just a little bit to make it condensed. So hopefully it won't be confusing, but it takes about, I think it should take about 4 minutes. So a week before the fire. The camera switched on, the recording light, a watchful eye, a witness even, and the preacher thought about mercy before he pulled the snake onto his lap. The trick required steady hands, yes, but your heart had to be still as well, unburdened. Pastor Micah stared at the animal as it coiled into a thin circle, almost an Ouroboros, eating its own tail, forever and ever, amen. The colors shone in the bright light as if the scales had been anointed in oil, the black iridescent next to the reds and yellows. He knew the old nursery rhyme couldn't be trusted. Red next to yellow can kill a fellow. But he also knew this one was a genuine article, not some king snake picked up by accident. No, he held life and death in his hands and he felt no fear. When he smiled at the reporter, his face opened like a curtain. Merritt Callahan crossed her legs and leaned forward, licking her lips. You'll ask me if I've ever been struck. That's natural curiosity is what that is, and I welcome it. You can't save people with all the doors shut, you know? You got to let a little light inside. Is that what you're doing here? Letting some light inside? Pastor Micah made a show of looking around New Hope. The wood hues from 1952, the plastic paneling meant to imitate oak. The linoleum floor had been replaced, but otherwise, the place looked a step away from being condemned. She's a looker, right? Pastor Micah lifted the coral snake, let it wrap around an outstretched arm, the most vibrant thing in the whole building except for the reporter's pink lipstick. How else would sin tempt us if it weren't beautiful, if it were easy to resist? No, the devil knows his work, sure enough. The reporter glanced at her notes, even though she didn't need them, and shifted uncomfortably at the word sin. Can you tell me about your Narcotics Anonymous group? She asked in a brisk, clipped voice. Pastor Micah ran a free hand through his black curls as dark as the snake's darkest stripes and looked at her with his pale green eyes. He figured the Lord had made him handsome for a reason, too. Let me tell you a story instead about a man who'd given up, lost his job, his family, his mind, found him collapsed on the side of Packer Road, a bundle of clothes more than flesh and blood, half ghost already. Pastor Micah felt the snake begin to move over his arm, looking for a way down. Another overdose. Nearly 100 deaths in West Virginia already this year, and it's only January. I always liked a smart lady. The reporter responded with a close-mouthed smile, and Pastor Micah knew the comment would be cut when the interview aired, for the best. This state's opioid problem is the worst in the nation, she said a little louder, getting the conversation back on her terms. Now, is that a problem or an opportunity? I ask you. For somebody who wants to help, this state, this town is paradise, or could be. The snake slid back onto Pastor Micah's jeans and tried to escape down his legs. The reporter flinched, and Pastor Micah gripped the animal gently behind the head, like a cat carrying a kitten. It was so small that too much pressure would snap its vertebrae. But why snakes? Not snakes, serpents. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. If God tests your faith and you pass, I'm telling you, praise him. There's no drug can compete with that rush. And the man you found. Pastor Micah squeezed a little, feeling the sliver between life and death. People call it a veil because there's so little fabric separating life from the afterlife. They can even see it sometimes if they're looking, a shadow moving in their periphery, a figure in their bedroom as they wake from a dream. That man should have been dead, and I thought he might be. But as I touched his forehead, I felt the spirit move between us, electric. God had a plan for him yet. The snake wrapped its tail around the preacher's arm, desperate to flee. Pastor Micah pressed a little harder, then released. The snake slithered onto the floor, causing the reporter to scoot her chair back. Pastor Micah could see the realization in her eyes, that she was alone, that she'd been foolish, that her ambition might cost more than she wanted to spend. Pastor Micah looked directly into the camera, not bothering to keep track of his pet. He trusted in the Lord. It wasn't his fault if his guest didn't feel the same. There's only one question worth asking, he said. When you get up in the morning, when you tuck yourself in again at night, and all the long hours in between, how's your faith today?
Love that. And titling it Before the Fire, so we know that there is.
We know that there will be a fire. Yes.
Excellent. Love it. Love it. There's something about the quality of your prose. It reminds me, as the introduction said, that you're also a poet, and so how much of your poetry do you find influencing your prose and vice versa? Do you have a intentional movement of putting poetry in as you're writing fiction?
Well, I have to be a little bit careful. I find myself sometimes I'll overwrite. So I'll have, if I'm really kind of into more of a poetry writing mode, I'll spend like 3 pages describing the, the snake, for example. And I realize, at some point you've got to get on with it. You have to move things along a little bit. And another thing I do that is allowed in poetry, but not as much in fiction, is I'll just suddenly throw in something in the middle of a chapter. So, the dog in the corner will get up and readers will say, "What, has there been a dog here all along?" So I think I have to be conscious not to let the poetry influence my prose writing too much, and then vice versa as well. So I do try to write them on different days. That's sort of how I approach that particular dilemma. But you also move between genres, and I wanted to ask you about that. So I should have, I have Scorpica, but it's on my other bookshelf. What's it like? What's it like to move between these two different genres? One which you get to make up everything yourself, and one in which you're somewhat bound a little bit by historical fact and detail.
Yeah, I think it sort of started, I had written things that weren't historical fiction that weren't published, and then my first published book was historical fiction. So after that, I sort of kept doing historical fiction, and historical really, it does have that specificity about it. And I think any writing, the careful selection of detail is one of the most important tools that we have as fiction writers to help the reader sort of go into the world that we're offering them. But particularly in historical fiction, there have to be details, and then you have to get the details right, because if you don't, then somebody on Goodreads or somebody in your email
Yeah.
say, no, the Derringer did not release the Model E until 2 years after that. So if you don't know that, then it's not good. But if you did know that and you changed it on purpose, you can put it in the author's note, which is where all the sins go, which is great. And then you beg forgiveness after the fact. But I had been writing historical fiction for quite a while when I got the idea that somebody needed to write like a matriarchal Game of Thrones, that there should be a big, splashy, classic swords and sorcery series of novels that follows a whole lot of different people, that's set in a matriarchal world. And I caught up on my fantasy reading. I had been a huge fantasy reader as a kid, as I think a lot of us are, and then sort of drifted away from it. But then decided, oh, well, somebody's probably written this, the thing that I'm envisioning, somebody has probably written. So I read a bunch of matriarchal fantasy and found that a lot of it fell into the categories of either it's a utopia, like women are in charge and everything's great now, or dystopia, women are in charge and everything's worse than ever. So, so what I was trying to do was not either of those poles, but in the middle. Women are in charge, and man, some of them are terrible people, but some of them are also really wonderful and selfless, and like women in power are the same as people in power. So so I decided that I should take a crack at writing it. And when I sat down to draft fantasy after so many years of writing historical, it was very freeing. It was great because I could say, oh, and it was the fall and they went hunting for conies, like on the border of the Bastion, and nobody can tell me any of those things are wrong because I made up the conies and I made up the Bastion and I made up the hunt, and so nobody can tell me I didn't get it right. I do then get held to those rules later. There are 6 types of magic in the 5 queendoms. And so if I list the types of magic at some point later in the novel and I only use 5, then it's on me, and then I should get emails about it. But instead, my copy editor usually, thank goodness for copy editors,
Oh, yeah.
usually save me from myself and my timeline mistakes. So it was really freeing to write fantasy. And then I had found Aimee Crocker during some earlier research for my book, The Arctic Fury, which takes place a little earlier. And my husband actually ran across her first and sent her to me. And I sort of filed her away for the future. When I started writing her story, it was very reassuring. After having written 3 complete works of fantasy, and they're all big, chunky, like 140,000 word things. I had written a lot of words, and all just created from your limit in fantasy is your imagination, right? You can just sort of do whatever. going back to writing about a real person who existed in the real world, where inventions couldn't be used before they were invented, I thought might feel constricting, but it really felt good. It really felt like, oh, okay, now I have something to start from. I didn't use all of the things that Aimee lived through or claims to have lived through in her memoir. We can talk more about that. But I did at least have somewhere to start from and say, oh, okay, well, this happened and that happened. And so it definitely, I thought I might have trouble switching, going back and forth, because then the way that the publishing schedule has gone, I have had to sort of focus entirely on one and then focus entirely on the other and then go back to the first. But it's been good. They've given me sort of a break. Each one has given me a break from the other, you could say.
Yeah.
And a lot of your work, so you've got your novels are mostly mysteries, but would you consider those all sort of the same genre or different? Because you've done series and standalone as well, right?
Well, this one was different because it is a mystery. It's contemporary mystery, which is my prose genre, but it's a retelling of Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. So I had to find a way to be respectful and honor the source material. It's one of my favorite plays, but also allow the characters to be spontaneous and to have their own motivations and goals. And so that presented a fun challenge, let's call it. I had the idea for this book more than a decade ago. Measure for Measure has been one of my favorite plays since high school. I love it. And then I found this cool old edition of it, this sort of 1920s edition of it at an antique store in Atlanta. And I bought it and I was reading it and I thought, oh, I wish I were a theater director because I feel like this would work so well if it were set against this backdrop of a snake handling church. So the original play has a sort of a religious backdrop as well, and that's informing how the characters act and how they, their motivations. And I just thought that would be really cool. I think it would work well. But I'm not a theater director, and so I thought, well, I'll try it as a novel. And I was still learning how to write novels. So it was still pretty, I don't think I had published my first book at that time, which is also in some ways freeing because no one has any expectations. But what I did was the wrong approach, which is that I took a pack of index cards and I went scene by scene and I imagined what each scene would look like if it were staged, basically. And I couldn't make it work. And so I put the project aside. And then when I was researching Stein's Handling Churches as my essay collection, I thought, oh, I still really like that idea. And I wonder if I throw out those index cards, if I can make it work. So that's what I did. So I thought, I'm going to throw out the index cards. I'm going to make sure I'm very familiar with the play, but I'm also going to let the characters be their own new characters. And that's what I did. I told Isabella's story as Essa and gave her own kind of agency in a contemporary setting where she gets to break a few more rules and have a bit of more say over her own life.
Good, good. Yeah, it feels like snakes have sort of been a theme for you in the past 10 years or so.
I
learned the phrase danger noodles from you
yes.
a number of years ago.
Well, I was looking because I had never heard of Aimee Crocker before I heard about your book. And so I won't even call it research. I was Googling and seeing what came up. And one of the first images that comes up is Aimee with her pet python. So
yes.
I'm only on chapter 2. Does the python make an appearance in this novel? Do we get any snakes?
I'm trying to remember because there's so much stuff. Like if you just read her Wikipedia entry, it is a journey. There is so much going on with this woman. So the basic shape of it is, for those who haven't taken a look at it yet, she was born to a well-off family in California, splitting their time between Sacramento and San Francisco. Her dad was the lawyer for the Big Four. So the Transcontinental Railroad was built by the Big Four. One of them was a Crocker, and then his brother was the lawyer for that whole railroad experience. And when he died when Aimee was 10, and he left money to her mother, her sister, and her, and she inherited $10 million, which is about 300 million in today's dollars. So that was a lot of money.
A lot of money. Yeah.
And she got to do a lot of different things with it. So, she was able to sort of get beyond some of the strictures of her time. So that was in the 1880s when she inherited the money. And then she spent like the next 5 decades traveling the world and getting tattoos and getting pet pythons and throwing parties for a python. That was one of the stories that didn't make it into the novel because there was just too much. But this would have been around the time that sort of that the Gilded Age TV show covers, that the old money people and the new money people were sort of at odds, and the new money people were throwing absolutely ridiculous parties with like dresses that lit up and all sorts of stuff. So she threw a party that she told people was for the Maharaja Ka. And when they came to the party, they found out that the Maharaja Ka was a snake. And she walked around the party, wearing him sort of like Britney Spears style. And that caused some consternation, but that was her MO. She wanted people to be unsettled, and unsettled they were in that particular case. So one thing about Aimee that I didn't think of until just now is very relevant. So I won't tell you whether she actually has 13 husbands, because that's in the book, but she certainly had a lot of them. And the first one that she had was named Porter Ashe, Ashe, and his family actually was instrumental in founding Asheville, North Carolina. So those of you who are local to Malaprops will appreciate the tie-in to this. She met him in California. They got married in secret. And once it came out that they had gotten married, the families sort of said, okay, fine, just be married. Like it's worse for us to try to split you up. So the families gave them a big honeymoon, and they got on the train to go down to Los Angeles. And I would never have gotten away with this in a completely fictional novel, but their honeymoon train goes off the rails and literally crashes. Which would have been way too much of a metaphor if I had made it up, but it actually did happen. So she was not Mrs. Ashe for all that long. So that was just one of the things. I'm like, oh, I'll put it in, but I have to put it in the author's note that it actually happened, or people will accuse me of going overboard on metaphors.
You like in Girl in Disguise, the train plot there is also unbelievable, but based on true events. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So
I'm trying not to spoil it if people haven't read it.
But, oh no! Yeah. I mean, it's history.
Fairly
I feel
well known. Yeah. Okay.
Spoiled that particular. Well, that history should be better known, right?
Yeah,
so this is the second book. This is the second book that I've written that's based on a real woman. The other one, Girl in Disguise, is Kate Warren, who was the first female private detective, and she helped save Abraham Lincoln's life on his way to his inauguration. Those of you who have heard of the Baltimore plot, there was a plan to get him in Baltimore. He had to get off one train and get onto another when he was doing his pre-inauguration train trip. So that too, as you pointed out, was a train. So
no, I think what's interesting about Kate Warren that I've heard you speak about is there was not a lot of information about her, that you really had to dig, that you had to access archives, and just any sentence you would kind of cling to. That seems quite different from Aimee Crocker, who wrote her own memoirs, and there are lots of newspaper articles.
Yes.
How did you decide what to include then? I feel like it's the opposite problem. You have so much material. How did you make choices?
Yeah, it's exactly opposite. There was too much. So she had the memoir. She was quoted widely. The memoir is also literally unbelievable. So most of what was in the memoir, I either put in the author's note that, I can't substantiate this, or I did try to stick more to the things that could be substantiated. She said she had a boyfriend in Shanghai who was a gang leader and tried to kill her and killed her mate instead. She said that she was kidnapped in Borneo by somebody who wanted to marry her and force her to marry him. And all these things. Like, I'm not sure, Aimee. Like, I'm not sure I can take you at face value on that one. So I included things that could be substantiated, like the train wreck, and like the fact that she had tickets on the Titanic for its maiden voyage, but ended up not going. All these, I had enough like things that definitely happened to fill out the book that I didn't have to put in the things that may or may not have happened.
Right.
But it was a very different issue having that material, because with Kate, I had, like you said, almost nothing to draw on. Kate, I had to make up a voice from scratch because she'd left no letters or diaries. Aimee left this memoir, so I sort of used the memoir as a jumping off point. But this memoir is such an exercise in self-marketing. First of all, it's called "And I Do It Again," so you can tell what she's trying to do with the memoirs. Be like, yes, I'm wild. Yes, I like. You got to be clutching your pearls when I'm around, and I don't feel bad about it at all. That was the message she was trying to send, and so that limited, this first marriage with Porter Ashe. She has like 3 sentences about it. She's like, yep. And then I got married and it didn't work out, and we tried, but yeah, it didn't work. And that was like just about literally it. So, but she did have a voice in it. And so that was my starting point. And then because my book is more of a narrated tell-all, it does talk about the private woman and her feelings instead of just the public persona. So I gave her a slightly different voice to accommodate that. And in your case, you're using multiple voices, right? Multiple points of view in this book. Talk a little bit more about how you differentiated them, how you chose those people as the lenses.
Sure. Well, in Measure for Measure, the protagonist, the hero of the play, is really Isabella. And the play opens the night before she used to enter a convent, and she is delighted by this fate. She is completely faithful. She wants to dedicate her life to her faith, and she is very excited about this transition in her life. And while she is in the midst of her prayers, someone comes to her and says that her brother has been sentenced to die. He's been sentenced to death for impregnating his fiance, and would she please come and plead for his life? So she's on the brink of getting the life of her dreams, basically, and she's pulled out, she's yanked out, and has to sort of plead and tries to plead for her brother's life. And then the man in charge decides that he will spare her brother's life if she sleeps with him. So he offers her this devil's bargain. It seems so modern, right? I feel like when I describe it, that part at least seems very modern, but this was Shakespeare's commentary on how power corrupts. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to tell Isabella's story through a contemporary lens. And that is how I started the project. I wrote her story set against this backdrop of a snake handling church that she's moved away from. And I liked it, but there felt like there were components missing. And I had the very obvious realization that Shakespeare play, of course, has so many characters, and every character is adding layers and nuance. So I thought, well, I want to give another character a voice. That was fun. Let's do it again. So in this case, I decided to give the fiance her own narrative. I think she has one line in the original play. She's very much a secondary character and would, of course, be dramatically affected by the situation. So I gave her own voice. She makes her living as a psychic in the book. So I did research on tarot. I did a class on tarot, which I really enjoyed, and different divination techniques. And with her story, I felt like it was almost working. I was like, okay, we've moved in the right direction. But finally, when I added the character of the reporter who appears in the prologue that's not a prologue, I thought, let me just give someone who is not as personally invested, who would not mind, stepping on toes, who doesn't care what the people of this town think of her. She's not from there. And once I had her story in place, I really felt like the story it had momentum to me, that it was really kind of moving forward. So I loved the idea of these 3 very different women telling their own versions of the story, and hopefully coming together in kind of interesting ways to eventually have their own stories, but also, of course, solve the mystery.
Always good to solve the mystery.
Always good to solve the mystery. That's
Yes.
sort of the rule number 1 I'll do. I can think of some examples who breaks that rule, but rule number one, if you're writing a mystery, offer the readers a solution.
Well, and I think as a reader, it's so fun to guess along the way, and you think you know what the answer to the mystery
Right.
is, but then it's so much more fun if you don't actually, if you guessed it wrong.
Yeah.
It's so funny that you mentioned tarot and psychics, because that's also a very big thing in the 13th
Yes.
Husband. So I have here the Goddess Tarot by my
Oh,
friend
nice.
Chris Walter. But yeah, so between our two books, we have a lot of snakes, tarot, psychics, women trying to make their own decisions and being told that that's not okay, all sorts of stuff. So even across the time periods and across the very different settings of our respective books, we do have some similarities there. And I don't know if you can quite tell, this is my snakeskin
Oh, wonderful.
dress. So.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, I love it. I love it. I don't normally wear jewelry, so I wore some jewelry, although I took my earrings off right before we started because they were clinking. It's like,
it doesn't quite, yeah.
I was like, I can't do an hour of clinking.
Better for you, better for us as well.
Right, exactly. Exactly. What are you reading? What are you reading that's not
Right now I
research
am it's funny because I'm usually a fiction reader for obvious reasons. I love fiction. I love to read historical fiction. I wake up a lot at night, so I read romance on my phone to sort of have something that I know it's not going to veer off in a crazy direction and keep me up at night. I learned that when I was nursing my kids many years ago and reading just whatever book I was into at the time. And I read Justin Cronin's vampire trilogy.
Oh my,
at
okay.
like 4 a.m. and then it was dark and I was alone except for a baby, which is like a little vampire if you think about it. But so and I'm like, I can't read scary books at night. I can't do it anymore. And then I just switched over to like, I'll read romance. It'll be okay. So I read lots of different things. I read fantasy because I need to keep up on that field as well. But right now I am listening to an audiobook that is nonfiction. It's called Cue the Sun, The Invention of Reality TV. So it's by Emily Nussbaum, the former, I think former, but maybe current TV critic for The New Yorker. She's won Pulitzers for her criticism. And it is a really, really interesting book because I think of reality TV as like Survivor and Top Chef and things like that. But she really goes back and shows the history of it with game shows, prank shows like Candid Camera, that was even earlier than that, Candid Microphone, and really sort of traces the history and follows some interesting stuff. I'm listening to it on audiobook, and to our host's point about independent bookstores, I want to make sure that people know about Libro FM, because it is structured like Audible. You get, you pay your monthly fee, you get audiobooks, but it supports independent bookstores. And I believe you can designate which independent bookstore it supports, or you can just let it spread out across the independent bookstores that belong. So if you love audiobooks like I do, you can still support independent bookstores while listening to audiobooks. Do you have a book that you're reading right now, either in whatever form that you'd like to share?
Well, before I do, I have to tell you that I think I told you the story before, but when I had my son, I was reading The Arctic Fury. And I think it's because it had the different point of views that it was, I could digest one story and then move to the next one. And I was reading it completely forgetting that we had an event scheduled. So a few days before the event, this was also a virtual event. Now I'm remembering it because it was during the pandemic. I got an email with all of this information. I thought, oh, well, I'm glad that this was the book that I was reading in my my brain fog, because now I have to speak intelligently about it. But that was
the late night reading sessions. Yes,
the late night reading sessions. Yeah. Also, I love The Arctic Fury. I was just recommending it for POV, but it's it's so kind of cold and dark, and you're up and late at night, and I like the idea of reading maybe romance novels or lighter content in the middle of the night. What am I reading right now? I'm reading Missing White Woman by Kelly Garrett, which is a contemporary thriller. A woman is at an Airbnb in New Jersey. She's spending the weekend with her new boyfriend. It's very exciting and fun until she wakes up one morning, goes downstairs, and there is a dead body in the foyer. So she runs outside, and of course, gets wrapped up into the case. So it's I think what I like about, I love Kelly Garrett's writing. I'm a fan of hers from the beginning. She has a series called the Detective by Day series, and then she's done one other standalone. But I feel like the pacing is just so well done. So it's a thriller. It's keeps me up at night. But she has this kind of wonderful way of kind of also kind of weaving in commentary and, you know, real character development. So it's not that every scene there's an explosion or a knife chase or something like that. So I'm a big fan of her thrillers. And then on the poetry front, I've been reading Diane Seuss's modern poetry for weeks, but that's not a comment on the poems. It's because I read one and then I put it down and I'm just kind of in awe of how she is writing. So yeah.
Sometimes you got to savor. That's one of the nice things about poetry, that I think more people need to read it, because you can just have a little clip and savor and then move on. And it requires a different kind of thought than reading novels and bigger chunks of things.
Maybe we should just make recommendations. What to read in the middle of the night? What are the things that you can just sip? What are the things that you can sip as opposed to having to kind of gulp down?
And for Erica and Greer's, what should I read next?
What should I read when I have insomnia?
What should I read at 3 a.m.?
Yeah.
I feel like now might be a good time to check in with Stephanie and see if we've got some questions from the audience here.
Yes, excellent. So thank you. It's been wonderful to listen to your conversation. And I just want to start by thanking you, Greer, for giving a shout out to Libro FM. I love Libro. We as indie booksellers love Libro. I'll go ahead and take just a minute to do like a full-on ad for them and let people know that if you make the switch to Libro, you get free audiobooks when you do that. When you sign up, you can go to Libro FM's website and find out more about that. And when you go to our website and the websites of a lot of other indies, if you search for a book, for instance, I've been posting the links to the books that you've been recommending on our website. And we have them all, by the way. So those books are on our shelves right now. But you'll also see a button on our website when the book is available on Libro, and the vast majority of them are, a button to say get the audiobook, and that takes you straight to Libro. And as Greer said, you can designate proceeds to us or to your local indie wherever you are, and you can also switch back and forth, right? If you move, or if you this month want to support one indie and next month want to support another indie, you can do that too. And they have actual people who provide customer service. I just can't say enough good things about them. They're awesome. So thank you so much, Greer. And I'm sorry to take up the time with that, but I really want them to stay in business because they're great. And they do provide a really good service. They're really excellent. Okay, so we do have questions. And I'm going to give you the first one, which came in by email before we even started. And it's from Steph Post, who is also a very accomplished writer. Hi, Steph. And this is for Erica. As someone who has followed your work for years now as both a poet and a mystery novelist, I'm interested to know how your writing process has changed over time. Was the experience of writing Hollow Bones different for you in any way? What do you feel you learned in writing your previous novels or poetry collections that help you to write Hollow Bones?
Steph, that's such a great question. And thank you for being here. Well, I had to sort of relearn the process because, as I said, my approach to sort of trying to map it out scene by scene just really wasn't working. It felt formulaic. It didn't feel natural. And I wanted to really tell this one story. I wanted to tell S's story. What was different and nice about this book is that I had already completed so much research for my essay collection that I didn't have to break in research, which I do sometimes. So I have a chapter in my essay collection, Snake, about signs following Pentecostal churches. And they were very prolific in the 1960s in the US. They are churches where the parishioners will handle venomous snakes during the services or also drink various poisonous liquids such as strychnine. And Steph, you have a wonderful depiction in one of your books, but I'm forgetting which one it is right now. If you can type it in, is it Chasing Smoke, maybe? But but the practice has died out over the years. It's currently illegal in all states except for West Virginia. They do still exist, but they're very difficult to research because they are illegal and they're operating, of course, as quietly as they can. And there were very few of them. So there are probably fewer than 100 still operating today. So I'd done all this background research, which was really helpful because I could just write the story as I wanted to tell it without kind of worrying about, without sort of looking over my shoulder or making, I'm big on putting brackets and being like, fix this later. And I didn't have to do as much of that when writing Hollow Bones. And that was very nice and perhaps something that I will try again. Although I think probably, as maybe Greer would agree and maybe Steph would agree, I feel like every time you start a new project, you think it's going to be easier this time. I know what I'm doing now. And then you never do. It's always, at least in my case, a bit chaotic and a lot messier than I would like it to be.
I just say now that when people ask me, what's your process? I say it's messy, because it's messy every single time. Never gets easier.
That's great. And Greer, would you like to speak to that as well in terms of any sort of, difference in your experience over the course of your writing career?
Yeah, I think I did learn to write historical fiction by writing historical fiction, and I was slow, and my process was even messier on The Magician's Lie, which was my first historical, and it took me 5 years to write because I would write and then research and then write and then research. I would stop writing in order to research. I would need somebody to put on a hat, so I would go research hats, and I would come back 3 hours later with the perfect hat, but then I would only have written like a couple of words. And then I would end up cutting the scene entirely. So now I do a big chunk of research. I draft the entire book. And then once I know that the scene is going to stay in, then I go back and do things like pull up an 1856 map of Chicago so that when Kate Warren chases somebody through the streets of Chicago, I'm using the actual streets. And I'm not going to get, again, emails or notes on my public reviews that say that this author doesn't know, well, actually, that street that is now in Chicago was not there in 1856. So I do that at the end.
Thank you. And the next question is for you, Greer. How did you, and this is from Vicky, how did you decide what to include? Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over someone. Sorry about that. But I'm coming back to you, Vicky. The next one was actually from Mary Sophie. And other than the origin of the Arctic Fury, how do you, Greer, discover women who you'd like to write about in historical fiction?
I feel like I just keep running into them everywhere. A lot of them in the Arctic Fury were inspired by real women. And so that was an intentional sort of like just comb the internet for interesting women of the 1840s and 1850s. But a lot of them I do just sort of stumble across. And so I've got a file, I've got a whole list. And then sometimes somebody else gets to it first. Like Margaret Fuller was somebody that I found in the Arctic Fury research. She was an amazing woman. She was a journalist, war correspondent. She taught at Bronson Alcott School. She was the best read person in America, not just the most well-read woman, but most well-read person. She was the first woman to use the Harvard Library. And Alison Pataki just wrote a fantastic book about her that came out this spring. So the issue is we are all, we're all looking at the same internet, going to the same libraries. So I can never guarantee that I will get to write about somebody who interests me, but I do stumble across them. I went to a chateau in France over the summer and found out that there's a really interesting woman who bought that chateau and rehabbed it with her husband from Spain that she met in like a graduate science program in Pennsylvania in like 1905 or something like that. So I'm like, oh, okay, maybe her. So they're everywhere. The untold stories of women are just absolutely everywhere. So let's all keep digging them up.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. And thank you for doing that. Thank you for being one of the excavators of those stories. That's great. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to Vicky, and then we have some more questions that came in through the email as well. This is a question asking audience, and we love that. Thank you. So the next one is, again, for Greer, how did you decide what to include and what to leave out of Aimee's story? I was very interested in learning more about her travels, and you talked a little bit about what you could verify and what you
Mhm.
couldn't, but Vicky's saying that they're interested in learning more about her travels, but maybe those stories were a little harder to verify. So
Yeah, I think,
yeah.
I mean, there was just so much of her travels. I did use a story. The king of Hawaii was traveling around at this time trying to promote Hawaii as a destination. Hard to believe that somebody would have to do that, but because now Hawaii, so he obviously succeeded. But he was going around inviting people to come see Hawaii and experience the native culture and see the natural beauty of Hawaii. And Aimee's mom was invited and didn't go, and Aimee was invited and did go. So she was in Hawaii for a little while, but she had long stints in Japan. She did go to both Shanghai and Borneo, although I didn't include the stories that she tells about there. She went to India. She was in Paris on and off for like 2 decades. So there was just so much travel. I tried to include what I could because the way that she traveled is what we would consider very modern, that she didn't want to just go and see what the tourists saw. She wanted to go become part of the culture, live where the people lived, and really participate and observe. And she actually got in trouble with some other people who were traveling for other reasons, like the missionaries in Hawaii who wanted to convert everybody in Hawaii to their religion. And they thought that Aimee was a natural ally of theirs, but Aimee was an ally of the Hawaiians and said, "Listen, missionaries, you got to get out of here. This is not the right thing for you to be doing." So I did want to put in as much of that as I could, but there's so much that I had to leave out.
Yeah, I've whenever I'm talking to authors, that's one of the things that I feel like would be I mean, there's lots about it that's hard, but I always feel like that's what it has to be one of the more challenging things, is the, that cutting room floor process, when you've just, when you've spent all of that time and energy and also learned so much that's fascinating, so kudos for doing that, taking on that very hard task to then leave us with something that's distilled down to a fulfilling reading experience, where no one is going in and saying it's like something's missing. Like the fact that you can do that is just amazing to me. So and then we've got Deborah, who's asked a couple questions. They're all good ones. And this is for Greer, but part of it I'm going to pose to you as well, Erica. So we're going to start with Greer. Regarding your research for historical fiction novels, what historical time period or place have you found to be the most fascinating, if any? And then the second part of the question is, what is the most surprising fact that you've discovered in the course of your research? And that's the question I'd like for Erica to also address as well, since you've, done some research for your work. So Greer, do you have a favorite time period so far?
Most of my published historical fiction is in sort of this 1850 to 1910 sweet spot. And I've become very comfortable there, but I do keep, seeing shiny objects in the 17th century or World War II. And I keep being told that maybe people are tired of reading about World War II, but maybe they're not. So I'm not sure whether I'm going to jump off in that direction. And then lately I've seen some interesting things about like the 1970s. I'm like, maybe, I don't know. But what's been most comfortable for me to write about is sort of this Gilded Age period that the 13th Husband is in. Woman 99 is set in the 1880s. 13th Husband starts in the 1880s. That's sort of a comfortable space for me to write in. And historical fact. Do you want to take that one first, Erica? Do you have one, something you found in your research that you just
surprising?
had to include?
Sure. Well, when I was working on my essay collection, I was lucky enough to speak with some physicists at Georgia Tech, and they are currently studying 2 different types of snakes. They're studying shovel-nosed snakes and sidewinder rattlesnakes. specifically how these snakes move through various types of terrain. Sidewinders in particular have a very unusual way of kind of throwing their bodies forward to create this movement, and they're able to move over very slippery landscapes such as sand. And the physicists there are studying this, and they told me point blank, one, because it's interesting, and they wanted me to emphasize this, that this is very interesting research, but also practically speaking, it might help with search and rescue missions, sort of designing robotics that can navigate challenging terrains. So it does have this practical application as well. So that was pretty fascinating.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Back to you, Greer.
All right. So I'm trying to figure out if the question is not specific to the 13th husband. I think the idea of Kate Warren having saved Abraham Lincoln's life on his way to his inauguration was the one thing, was something that just electrified me, because I'd never heard of Kate Warren. I feel like everybody can name the guy who killed Lincoln, but nobody knows the name of the woman who saved him from dying 4 years earlier. And he never would have been president. And I think things could have turned out very differently if he hadn't been. So the idea that there was a woman who just sort of walked in and asked for a job in the 1850s and was instrumental in stopping that, I think was pretty cool.
Yeah, and it is really fascinating. And there is so much of that history that there are things that you hear and you're just like, how have I never heard this before? Yeah. Why is this not something that isn't taught in schools, or at least, discussed somewhere that it would have come up? Amazing. Yeah. And Deborah has another question, and it's about audiobooks, which has become a favorite subject of the evening. But this is a great question. And it's for both of you. When it comes to audiobook adaptations of your books, have the narrators selected to read your books matched with the characters' voices in your head? And do you have any say in who the narrator is?
I can go first. For some of my books, I have had the chance to choose the narrator. I've gotten samples of people's voices and been able to say which one, what are my first and second choices. And some I haven't. Some it's different publishers, different times, those sorts of things. I think my best experience was, and most people, I think, who listen to audiobooks at this stage have heard of Julia Whalen, who was my very first audiobook narrator for The Magician's Lie. And I told her once that I listened to her voice doing it, and that the way that she said things was exactly the way that I heard them in my mind. And she said that was the sign of a good writer. And I said that was the sign of a good narrator. So it was mutual admiration society. But yeah, I think she had an amazing match to the character. And The Magician's Lie is partially narrated. It's got two different voices, but the Arden's voice is the one that you hear most. And she did Arden's voice for that. So I think all of my audiobook experiences have been positive, but that was the biggest first one where I'm like, oh yes, that is the narration. That's perfect.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah. I've also had positive experiences. I think it's really remarkable how these talented narrators are not only able to bring the story to life, but then embody these different characters that when I'm listening to audiobooks, that's what I'm always astonished by, is that I can tell who is speaking. And when I read, I can't do that at all, sort of distinguish between the different characters. So I think, yeah, I've also had very positive experiences, and but no say in the narrators, but that's fine with me.
Yeah, that would be another set of, I mean, it's cool to have a say, but that's also then it's another set of sort of tough choices that you have to make in a process.
Absolutely.
That includes a lot of tough choices. So yeah, it's a lot of pressure. That brings us exactly to the top of the hour. So I'd love to just invite both of you to share any final thoughts that you have before we say goodnight to our audience this evening. And then Greer, if you don't mind starting, and then we'll end with Erica.
Yes. First of all, thank you, attendees, so much. To those of you who are here on the event and those of you who are watching it after the fact, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Malaprops, for having us. Really appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
I'll echo Greer's sentiments. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you, Greer. It's always fun. And so grateful to have Malaprops only 2 hours away from me here in Knoxville. So not quite my local bookstore, but close.
And feel free to give a shout out to your local. I know I heard you talking about him earlier.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
yeah.
Union Ave Books here in Knoxville.
Union Ave. Hi, friends at
Yeah.
Union Ave. All right. Thank you both so much for being with us this evening. We appreciate it. And thank you for me as well to everyone who's joined us live and on the recording, which is also something that I tend to say at these events. Yeah. So folks, if you're watching the video, we appreciate you too. Thank you. And we hope you're able to join us for another event sometime in the future, in the store, online, however you can join us. We appreciate it. And until we meet again, stay safe and well and happy reading. Good night, everybody.